It was the evening of December 29th, 1922, and John Powell gazed out into the audience at Boston's Symphony Hall. To his side sat the massed ranks of the Boston Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Pierre Monteux. They were there to perform Powell's most celebrated piece, his Rhapsodie Nègre, for piano and orchestra. It was a work that in the days before Gershwin mania of the mid-1920s had made John Powell one of the most famous composer-pianists in America. Today, John Powell merits barely a sentence in music history books. Most would argue for good reason. Because the Rhapsody Nègre lies at the heart of one of the most troubling and shameful stories in 20th century music. It's one that many would prefer to forget.
Listening to his music makes my skin crawl. John Powell did real harm to real people, and he used classical music to do it. Once you know that, you can't listen to this music and not be queasy.
We all know Gershwin and Copland, and he's sort of the missing link in that development towards uniquely American music, both for good and ill. His neglect is unwarranted, although it's certainly deserved.
John Powell was important because he was representative of something so much larger. For the person who says, oh, he was exceptional, we don't really need to think about him that much, I would say, no, quite the opposite. We absolutely need to think about the John Powells of the world because they hold the keys to understanding a lot of what we're going through right now.
This is a documentary about how classical music can be harnessed to spread hateful ideas about race, eugenics, and the value of human beings. The ideas and language explored are disturbing and sometimes stomach-turning. But I'm telling it because this isn't just the tale of one man. It's a warning from history and a conversation with the present day.
I do remember that when I arrived here, there was a picture of him in the library, and some of the librarians worked pretty hard to get his picture taken down because we didn't really want to look at a eugenicist anymore.
Bonnie Gordon is Associate Music Professor at the University of Virginia, where Powell spent much of his career.
John Powell was a composer, instrumental in a program of cultural eugenics, where he put in sound and music a logic of white supremacy. Powell basically says you can use music to determine what counts as human. He was instrumental in getting laws passed that in effect made eugenics something the government could impose.
Powell almost single-handedly created a sense of racial panic and got past the Racial Integrity Act, which was the first time in the United States that there was a law that said anybody with any black ancestry was considered legally black. And so if somebody could not prove their whiteness and they wanted to marry a white person, they could not get married. Kids were hounded out of public schools. To this day, there are still Native American tribes in Virginia that have not been able to get federal recognition, and music was his tool to do this. My name is Lester Fader, and I am now a senior world correspondent at BuzzFeed News. John Powell was the most important composer and musician from the American South before World War I. His work was programmed by all the major symphonies in the United States. His best-known composition, the Rhapsodie Nègre, that was performed more than 50 times in New York 10 years after it premiered. There's no question that he was a major figure in classical music at the time.
taking you into our vault to show you some highlights, I guess might be the word, from the John Powell papers.
The question of why we should be talking about John Powell is a complicated one.
Walk ahead of me.
I mean, in some ways, to uncover what a horrible person John Powell is actually pretty easy work. The trickiest part is to think about what to do with that information.
This is the inventory for the collection that Ellen put together.
Now, I think it was 75 boxes. My supervisor used to tease me that I would need an exorcism after doing this collection.
Over the last year, Molly Schwartzberg and Ellen Welch have been overhauling the University of Virginia's John Powell archives.
I think the most striking thing about it was that his work was regarded so favorably. I do know he had a lot of fan mail, and he was thought to be very kind. And then there's this horrific side. You know, the comments that you would see in his writings that were just so offensive to every day coming to work and read that. It was sickening.
Powell was consumed with an obsession of not just making sure that white supremacy was unassailable, but was convinced that, as he would have put it, if the white population is tainted with black blood, it would lead to the inevitable ruin of civilization. And he used his composing as a tool to spread that message.
Here we have a folder of correspondence and other documents relating to important people, and I have pulled out a dinner invitation, a lovely engraved dinner invitation from the President and Mrs. Roosevelt, who request the pleasure of the company of Mr. and Mrs. Powell. His reputation as a performer and a composer got him into all sorts of important places and helped him build relationships with important people. To this day, there are still repercussions. About 3 weeks ago, there was a newspaper report that a group of couples were suing the state because you still needed to indicate your race on marriage certificates in Virginia. That is a remnant of that past.
When I was a child in the 70s, we learned about Virginia as the seat of American democracy. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson were here. The Declaration of Independence you can locate here. Now we teach very different things. Virginia is also the seat of white supremacy. It's the seat of the chattel slave system. There's a huge amount of press right now in 2019. We're at the 400th anniversary of the importation of 20 Africans to Port Comfort in Virginia. And it was by no means the first instance of African slaves, but it's an important moment. And Virginia is really the seat of a lot of these tensions.
John Powell was born in 1882 to a prominent middle-class family in Richmond, Virginia. The American Civil War had ended less than 2 decades previously, and Powell grew up in a society in which the racist legacy of slavery continued to dictate social hierarchy. This wasn't just visible in the physical segregation of schools and institutions under state law. As a young piano student at the University of Virginia, Powell was steeped in a philosophy that blended music tuition with the pseudoscience of racial difference.
We're in a period in the early 20th century when science is consumed with trying to locate racial essence.
Journalist J. Lester Fader.
Eugenics was taking off as a scientific discipline in both Europe and the United States. There was extensive studies of phrenology, of cranium size, and Powell was steeped in that worldview. And for him, one place that you could tell what the interior of a person was like was through sound. This was a time when we would see classical music conversations speaking about the German race or the English race or the Slavic race, that all of these different groups had a unique temperament that could be heard in the different music that they made. So like Bela Bartok was not a racist in the way that Powell was, but the work that he did where he would take different kinds of folk tunes and attribute to different groups, that was reflective of this idea that music was an expression of some kind of innate temperament that people had because of where they were born. This is important because when he goes to Vienna in the early 20th century to study piano, he gets involved in a Turnverein.
The German word Turnverein loosely translates as gymnastics club, fraternities where young men would meet to exercise both body and mind. Activities like athletics and mountaineering would be complemented by fireside debates about the nature of great art and its relationship to a healthy society. These often had a deeply sinister side, incubating ideas about culture and race that would later surface in Nazi ideologies of the 1920s and 30s. As a young piano student, John Powell took eager part in discussions about what constituted the pinnacle of musical culture.
Powell was influenced with this idea that there was something about the Teutonic race that was special. And in fact, in his words, it was transcendent, that whiteness had these universal qualities that were the best of humanity.
I think it's easy listening to John Powell's story to mentally place him in a long distant past, to tell ourselves, oh, what a terrible man, but also that we've moved on, live in different times now. And that's quite dangerous, because I think in many ways we're still dealing with the legacy of people like Powell. After all, when it comes to the idea of white cultural supremacy, how different are things really today?
Music theory is overwhelmingly white in the United States. Easily over 90% of the people who are engaged in music theory are white themselves. My name is Philip Ewell. I am an associate professor of music theory at Hunter College in New York City. A white racial frame has emerged in music theory, which essentially is exclusionary. It is pushing aside non-whiteness. The composers and the music theorists that we put forth in the music theory classroom are nearly 100% white. So the music that came out of Europe from the 17th through 19th centuries, the idea of the key of C major and harmony and melody and Mozart and Haydn and Bach represented the pinnacle of a framework for music theory. There are other music theories on the planet from Asia and India, the Middle East, many, many centuries, if not millennia old, that would be quite easy actually to study. As soon as you invoke this theoretical system, a music theorist, this might have been myself just some years ago, said, well, that's ethnomusicology. We don't have to think about it. Thank you very much.
By framing our experience of music in the white Western European tradition, we ignore the fact its foundations often have much more complex roots. Cellist and sitar player Pete Yelding.
If we look at equal temperament, we're told that it was a great development in European classical music history. But as a mathematical system, it was actually conceived in China a century before by a mathematician called Zhu Jiayu. And it became fashionable in Europe at a time that putting very broad grids on things was fashionable, so it kind of parallels the construction of the modern map, the map which squashes the continent of Africa. This is the beginning of the creation of this idea of a neutral self. Now, when you've got this idea of a neutral self happening, everything else is all of a sudden marked as not neutral. And so that's the absolute bedrock of modern classical music.
I wanted to find out how these deeply embedded ideas play out in today's classical music world. And so I've invited 3 young musicians into the studio to find out more about their own experiences of race and exclusion. Cellist and sitar player Pete Yelding, who you've just been listening to, the oboist Uchenna Ngwe, and composer Daniel Cadane. Now, I realise you might be doubtful about the idea that race still underpins the way we play, think and talk about music in the 21st century. Here's musicologist Philip Ewell again with a message for skeptics.
One main aspect of music theory's white racial frame is the belief that the institutions or structures don't have anything to do with race or whiteness, and that to somehow examine them critically would be unfair or inappropriate. You'll often hear, oh, what does race have to do with this? This isn't about race. Stop talking about whiteness, Phil. I get it. It's harder to ask yourself, how are the structures and institutions of what I do unfair? And how can I begin to make new structures that are truly more inviting.
Classical music as a genre is a great place for implicit bias to sort of hide out. As a composer who is of mixed heritage, my mum is from Russia, my father's from Eritrea, it's always interesting to see how people's opinions are put forward.
My first memory that there might be a problem when I was about 10 years old was I was at school and a teacher came up to me. I must have been playing the orchestra or something. She came up to me and she said, "Little girl, you know this music isn't for you." I didn't quite understand what she meant. It was as I got older, I was pleased that somebody had actually said it out loud, because actually that attitude is still prevalent, isn't it? What do you think, Janet?
I think people's expectations of what they see in classical music really feed into a lot of this. I mean, the other day somebody asked me what I play and assumed I was a singer, which I've had all the way through my career. They never guess anything else. They always start with singer.
I think that's a really pertinent point, actually. There's a propensity for composers to be able to define the other. So as an example, so I have Romany heritage, and I was working an usher shift at a concert hall. It was a miscellaneous 18th century romantic piece of music, conjuring images of Roma people. And an audience member came out and said, I definitely could hear the gypsy section in that piece. The only thing that was different from the rest of the piece was that it was in a minor key. Didn't quote from any of the cultures or anything like this. There is also a very dangerous complacency in programming contemporary composers, and you can see the same issues of Orientalism play out. Why is it that Steve Reich is celebrated for his use of drumming from West Africa and put into a classical music program, but you don't see the programming of the actual people who invented that music? Why is John Cage a spokesman for Zen when he had a few lessons in it and all of a sudden all of his music is representative of this? It's the question of who's doing the defining.
Back at the turn of the 20th century, an ideological struggle was emerging over who got to define American music. Pianist Nicholas Ross.
Dvorak came to America and started what became Juilliard. And when he arrived here, he wanted to encourage composers to look to American folk music and specifically African-American music.
He threw down a gauntlet to American composers to use the influence of black music to make music that sounded distinctly American. This horrified Powell.
Powell's musical response to Dvorak's New World Symphony of 1893 was his own Sonata Teutonica, composed in the first decade of the 20th century. In it, he tries to distill the essence of the Germanic masters he'd obsessed over at his Vienna Turnverein into a calling card for white supremacy. But Powell's first attempt to fuse musical and racial theories was a dismal failure. At over an hour long, one contemporary critic dubbed his new work Sonata Titanica for its sheer, unsinkable pomposity.
The effect overall is just rather dull. It just doesn't keep one's attention. It doesn't work as a larger structure. I don't feel like there's a cohesion. This seems to have been Powell's ideology informing his music making. And once I think you start saying to yourself, I'm going to write a piece that represents this viewpoint, that's when you start writing poor music, I think.
Enraged by its failure, Powell would instead crystallize his beliefs in a notorious speech given at the peak of his fame some 2 decades later.
So in 1923, Powell was invited to give a lecture at Rice University in Houston. He calls Music and the Nation, about the relationship between music, the building of a national identity, and race.
People like Ravel came and gave lecture recitals there, and they were able to bring in these big names. Well, in this time, John Powell was a really big name.
He took aim in that speech at other composers who were engaged in trying to write quote-unquote American music. So he goes on to say, our only hope for a nation in America lies in grafting the stock of our culture on the Anglo-Saxon root. So taking the music that came from the British Isles to the United States, building a national music out of it, while simultaneously implementing a social policy that was designed ultimately to eliminate non-white populations in the United States.
The language of white supremacy that John Powell uses in his lecture is abhorrent. he talks openly of inferior breeds, discusses what he describes as the Negro problem, and outlines his fear that if the Anglo-Saxon roots of American music and culture were, in his words, tainted by a single drop of non-white blood, that the USA faced extinction.
While I have not kind of read the entire lecture, I have read enough of it to know I don't want to read the rest. You've got to understand then that he's going around giving concerts all around the States, playing recitals and saying these same things to anybody who will listen.
One of my students unearthed a letter from him in which he said, "If I never wrote another piece in order to pass such legislation, I don't mind."
On March 20th the following year, 1924, Virginia's General Assembly signed into law the Racial Integrity Act, forbidding marriage between people of different racial backgrounds and classifying as white only people who could prove they had no trace of any non-Caucasian ancestry. John Powell had been one of the law's most celebrated advocates. It wouldn't be overturned for more than 4 decades.
We go to great lengths to say that you still need the arts, you still need literature, you still need music. And one of the reasons we say that, or what we're implying, is because it makes you better people. That if you are well-read, well-cultured, listen to certain kinds of music, that you will understand that racism is wrong.
Bonnie Gordon, then Uchenna Ngwe.
I'm here to tell you as a music professor that that is absolutely not the case. And there's always that moment of shock when you find out someone from your experiential world has these horrible ideas.
I think it's kind of frustrating that we are having this conversation because of him. I would quite like things like that to be forgotten, but at the same time, I'm a researcher. And so it's important that we understand what has been. I'm not saying you can't play the music, but do it consciously.
Okay, so here's a review of my CD that was published on AllMusic. It begins like this. John Powell is an American composer whose detestable, racially motivated political views have overshadowed his contribution to music.
Pianist and researcher Nicholas Ross is one of the few performers to have explored John Powell's music in depth.
An English pianist, Nicholas Ross, has decided to brave the potentially injurious political headwinds and press forward with this fine recital. So I didn't necessarily know I was looking at injurious headwinds when I made the recording.
I was asked by a museum in North Carolina to make a recording of music that would have been popular in America around the 1920s. I had Fats Waller, I had Gershwin, but I looked around and decided I wanted to look for something less well known. And I must have got something like 20 scores through into library loans. And I opened up a really beaten up copy and started playing it.
This piece was composed in 1907. And the other piece I have is At the Fair, and this is the first edition of that, which is 1911. So these are both early works dating back to the beginning of his career.
Nick was to discover that these early works had more in common with Dvorak's multicultural vision of American music than John Powell would later admit. Powell was, it seems, not just a virulent racist, but a hypocrite too.
What attracted me as a pianist was it used a blues scale, so uses... We all know about the flat and third, that blues note, but the flat and fifth might be used, and that's where that scale comes from. So what he was doing was out of the ordinary. And I think the most interesting piece of all was the piece Clowns. That clearly uses ragtime.
One of the pieces, Clowns, was particularly fascinating, using ragtime, but reminiscent of Shostakovich almost, the way he modulates through all these different keys. And I thought, wow, this music is really interesting. And so I practiced hard, and in 2 days I'd really learned a lot of this music. And then I decided I wanted to find out more about him. I found an article posted online. My stomach dropped, to realize that what he actually represented was reprehensible.
This idea of can you separate the person from the music, I'm firmly of the opinion that you can't.
Pete Yelding, followed by Daniel Cadane.
My old housemate put a string quartet on, and it was kind of nice string music. And he was like, this was written by Charles Manson. And my hairs went on, I was like, oh, turn it off, turn it off. The music hadn't changed, but my knowledge that it was written by a serial killer changed my perspective and reception of the music. And that's because, again, going back to this idea of the aesthetic imagination, things don't happen over there. Sound waves go into us, they change us inside. They're not experienced in a vacuum. And so, yeah, with this man, we can't separate him from his views. They're interrelated because he was a whole person.
What are your thoughts, Dan?
I also want to make the point that I think by tackling these issues, it gives people courage. If you see something similar, to challenge it. At the end of the day, we're all in the same industry. And if you have a voice, then do use it.
Nick, do you feel you have a sort of social responsibility to your audience and what you play them?
Well, I would say that was part of my motivation. As I said, I was at this sort of turning point 2 days into learning the music, going, and then suddenly realized, well, here was an opportunity to educate. And I had program notes for my CD, talk in depth about his racism. And I actually presented a lecture recital on the suites. And I had the chair of the music department from Radford University, and they said to me, we have a John Powell Hall. We didn't know anything about it. We're going to have to go tell our board and everybody about this.
In the early 2000s, there was a decision made to rename Powell Hall. My name is Caitlin Skaggs, and I am the Associate Vice President for University Relations. At Radford University, we're committed to a campus that's supportive and inclusive for all types of students. And when it became discovered that there were some serious concerns about what Powell might have stood for or did stand for outside of his musical contributions, that's when conversations began regarding our need to align with our commitment. We can't control the past, but we certainly can control the future and what we do moving forward from here.
This is a story with deep roots in America and its culture. Is there a danger of thinking that these issues aren't as pronounced in the UK?
I think there is, because it's always easier to look at what other people are doing when it's negative, rather than acknowledging what's actually going on.
Uchenna Ngwe.
If we don't acknowledge it, we can't actually make any changes. We can't improve anything. And we'll continue to have people having diversity conferences without anyone making tangible change. Now people think diversity is just about having some people of colour on the stage. They're up there, so we've solved everything. But you need to look at how those people are the ones who've become successful. Where is the gap now, and how we can then close that gap looking at what's come before.
What do you think, Pete?
Who is it, historically, the canon, Beethoven, Bach? It's these old white dead men. And we're ignoring a whole load of bodies, people sat next to us who we're not allowed to cough next to, and the third violin at the back. Yet we're all paying respect to this person who's conquered all.
What about the notes on the page? Are there ways in which racist ideas are encoded into the music itself in ways we might not realise?
Definitely, especially if you're looking at late 19th, early 20th century music. We have pieces by Debussy, springs to mind, for a lot of the French composers, and that stuff was extremely popular, and none of it was really based on any real music. It was an idea of the Orient, the Far East. That's the stuff that I learnt to play when I was in school, and no one ever really spoke about it. As I got older, things like the Gollywog's Cakewalk would come up, and I started to refuse to play it. And we do need to be questioning more about what it actually means.
In this programme, we've explored how John Powell sought to fuse white supremacism with classical music and culture, how he used his fame as a musician to advance these ideas, and how that legacy still plays out today. In many ways, it's a story that runs counter to the way I've often thought about American music in the early 20th century, the stories of Gershwin, Duke Ellington, and the Harlem Renaissance. It was mystifying to me. How did a racist ideologue rise to become one of the most famous classical musicians on both sides of the Atlantic?
This is a folder of newspaper clippings from critics in the UK.
Archivist Molly Schwartzberg.
Quotations from the Times of London, the Daily Telegraph, the Sheffield Telegraph. Reviewer.
In 1918, John Powell premiered the Rhapsodie Nègre, and it was his most widely performed piece.
Lester Fader.
Another musicologist found that there were at least 50 performances of the Rhapsodie Nègre in 1929, so this is more than a decade later.
It was actually the most performed American piano concerto before Rhapsody in Blue.
Another Scottish newspaper says, the Rhapsody, this is the Rhapsodie Nègre, is the work of one who has penetrated to the real spirit of his material and grasped its pathos and indeed its tragedy.
The Rhapsodie Nègre wasn't just Powell's most popular work. It was music into which he methodically and explicitly poured a philosophy of racial hatred, aiming to depict white supremacy in sound, rhythm, and pitch. Decoding its message is a horrible task. As a purely instrumental piece, with no words or staging, it could be easy to imagine the Rhapsody's audiences as oblivious to the composer's ideology, to have heard the music as abstract tones, ignorant of the racism beneath. In fact, this was Powell's greatest fear.
He did not trust his listeners to interpret the music. So he always wrote these incredibly lengthy program notes explaining minute to minute what he thought the music was doing. Here's how he describes the beginning of it. The Rhapsody opens with a wild plaintive cry. This motive fades away in a mysterious, terror-stricken tremolo, and the piano enters with a rhythm suggesting of tom-toms palpitating through the night.
Writing under the pen name of Richard Brockwell, Powell's notes to the 1922 Boston performance of his Rhapsody make nauseatingly clear the ideas he was trying to convey through sound.
First of all, it's important that the Rhapsodie Nègre was a rhapsody. As Powell understood Black people, they were driven by this kind of innate and uncontrollable set of urges that were inherent in their racial temperament. White people, on the other hand, were governed by their intellect and personal will as opposed to the desires of their body. A rhapsody suggests improvisation. It doesn't make claims to grand structure the way that the sonata does. Essentially, Black music and Black people were not sophisticated enough to build a structure like that in his worldview. The Rhapsodie Nègre is incredibly dissonant. It's constantly moving, and his ideology that's layered on top of that is the belief that that instability is infectious and will spread to anything it comes into contact with, and is inevitably going to lead to the downfall of civilization.
The way the Rhapsodie Nègre was received should give us deep pause for thought. Not just about the people that witnessed its performances in the 20s and 30s, but about our own contemporary ideas about separating art from the ideology of its creator.
One of the people who wrote about this piece was Sir Donald Francis Tovey, who at the time was the UK's preeminent musicologist. Tovey, writing in 1928, said, Mr. Powell has the profoundest respect for the Negro as artist and human being, but profound sympathy is very different from the facile sentimentality that refuses to recognize the dangers that threaten two races of wildly different stages of evolution that try to live together.
Concertgoers from New York to Sheffield, Boston to Berlin were made aware of every last repugnant idea behind Powell's musical conception. It's true of the time that some listeners would have supported his views, but many chose simply to ignore them.
Partway through, he suddenly introduces Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, the spiritual. There were, among musicians who were trying to champion Black music at the time, this belief that spirituals were a sophisticated sort of Black music. But of course, what he's going to do with that is, over time, make it really unstable until it decomposes. He he describes the music getting wilder and harmony more suggestive until the music, incapable of maintaining itself, is overwhelmed in a flood of primal sensuality. The Rhapsody closes with a shriek from the bass, accompanied by a tempestuous glissando streaming up the full range of the piano.
The Rhapsodie Nègre propelled Powell's music and his white supremacism into the very highest levels of American society. He became friends with the rich and powerful, including the President and First Lady.
Music has always been used for horrible ends. I mean, think about music making men go into battle. Think about music being appropriated by the Nazis. The idea of music as being kind of an instrument of some sort of culture that doesn't really touch the torrid side is just, it's a myth in every possible way. I mean, musicians are as horrible as anybody else.
John Powell died in 1963 at the age of 80. A decade previously, Virginia's Assembly had declared a statewide John Powell Day to mark, in the governor's words, his exceptional contribution to the cultural life of America. In truth, Powell had virtually stopped composing after the Rhapsodie Nègre. Instead, he used its fame to spread his racist theories to anyone who would listen, from his office at the University of Virginia to concert halls across America. In the 1930s, he founded a folk festival in the mountains of Appalachia and claimed, ludicrously, that ragtime and spirituals actually came from Anglo-Saxon roots. And in death, as the memory of his music faded, Powell's virulent racism was quietly airbrushed from history. For years, his entry in the Grove Dictionary made only vague reference to racial concerns. Today, it's tempting to leave Powell in the dustbin of history where his views belong. But I think that's dangerous. Because in consciously forgetting about ideologues like Powell, we risk becoming complacent about their influence and their legacy.
It's just really hard to talk about this stuff. It's so, because it's so powerful right now.
You know, there was a period where it was quite easy for people to say, well, we don't have slaves, we don't have Jim Crow, and we don't have eugenics, so we're okay now, which is very clearly not the case. And I think what the Unite the Right rally showed was precisely how dead those ideas are not.
What happened in Charlottesville was truly horrendous, and it's just shocking to me that those people who believe what Powell believed somehow have been given a forum.
On the 12th of August 2017, hundreds of far-right white nationalists marched through the city of Charlottesville in Virginia. The riots that followed resulted in the death of an anti-racist protester and made headlines worldwide.
Fear and hate have been given license in our country.
I suspect that internationally, the rally on Saturday, August 12th, is the most pervasive, and it's the one where Heather Heyer was murdered by a car. It's the one where there are pictures all over the news of people in Confederate flags with Nazi symbols beating people up. But there was a torch rally the night before, right outside the window of the office we're sitting in.
That march came right through the university and was staged behind our main library. We're right next door. The white supremacist marchers gathered behind that library, lit their tiki torches, and marched past Jefferson's Rotunda, chanting, "You will not replace us."
You will not replace us!
The organizer of the Charlottesville March was a prominent neo-Nazi and music graduate named Richard Spencer.
Richard Spencer was a music major at the University of Virginia. This was a guy who wrote a thesis on Adorno and produced operas in Germany. You know, he understood symbolic power.
Richard Spencer probably knows quite a bit about John Powell.
Music journalist Aaron Keeble.
The alt-right sees the arts as integral to a racial identity. And I found an article on Countercurrents Publishing. It's a platform for the North American New Right. And so they had an article on Powell talking about how he was really pro-Anglo-Saxon and how great it would be if people could remember the music of their heritage the way Powell did. So I worry that Powell will be upheld as this sort of model.
I made this recording in January of 2006, and my research on John Powell happened between 2004 and 2005.
Pianist Nicholas Ross.
It seems to me that our culture has changed since that time. If I were to find John Powell's music today, I would not make this recording because of the current political context.
I'll be honest. When I first came to the story of John Powell, I had deep concerns about even touching it. Why bring into focus the life and work of a white supremacist? But as I talked to the people studying his legacy, and to musicians like Daniel, Uchenna and Pete, I came to realise that this subject's value lies in challenging our own assumptions about the relationship between music, race and power. John Powell's story should make us feel deeply uncomfortable, in part because it offers us a mirror to examine ourselves.
Let's be clear, the vast majority of persons in the United States are not at all like Richard Spencer or John Powell, for that matter. That's one of the reasons why people have such a hard time talking about race and certainly whiteness.
Philip Ewell, then Molly Schwartzberg.
You know, if somebody thinks that by virtue of the fact that they voted for Obama, they have black friends, that they can't be part of a white racial frame problem, then you have a lot of work to do.
I'm from Berkeley, California, which is famous as possibly the most radically liberal left-wing city in the country. And I grew up proud of being from Berkeley. Turns out that one of the white supremacists who was arrested at the Unite the Right rally is from Berkeley. It's easy to be idealistic. It's easy to ignore what's right in front of you and only see the best of your own community.
How can we, as a community, tackle the legacy of someone like John Powell? It's clear we can't simply detach his music from his vile ideology, nor can we pretend he never existed. But maybe we can harness his story to do what he himself would have hated, to shift the dynamic of how we frame and approach music history and theory, and shine a light on the cultural and racial supremacy that continues to scar our world today.
The library collects documentation of what happens at UVA and what happens in Charlottesville. The morning after that horrible event, I had colleagues calling me to say they had gathered up tiki torches that they found discarded behind the library, and did we want them for the collections? My first impulse was to say no, but of course I had to say yes. It is our job to document the fullness of history in any way that we can.